As I was sharing with you, Bucky, your story, it is amazing how you, living in West Virginia, were influenced by the Scottish and the Irish who were telling stories through, you said, grannies and old men in the mountains, just raised at listening, hearing those stories. And they stayed with you to be a part of you. And so, what were you going to do? You're going to study. So, you go to Otterbein, and Lizzie went to Otterbein too, huh?
Yeah.
And studied Carl Jung and the paranormal, the parapsychology, the study of dreams was very appealing to you.
Mhm.
Loved it, in fact, is what I sensed, huh?
Yes.
And then you went back to West Virginia and you studied archaeology, which certainly is a connection there with the spirits, huh?
Yes.
And so you became educated in this area. And so as you um, were educated, you weren't going to let go. So you went to, and I want to ask you, you went to the short north,
Hmm.
lived in the short north where there's a lot of storytelling, and oh, there was the kitty cat
Yes,
coming.
he just made a appearance.
But in the short north, there has been studies and excavations where they're not. Where,
Hmm.
and I read that you had not mentioned that, but you're in the area where there is a former graveyard or two
Hmm.
and stories. And so, as you began to tell these stories, not only was the Halloween popular, but then people wanted you to do tours around all parts of Columbus.
Yes.
And we have, as you know, our uh, haunted, wonderful, beloved Cultural Arts Center. We
Hmm.
had Turkey Paranormal say after they went through our Cultural Arts Center, yeah, you got them. You found spirits, paranormal activity in the area that you live in. And besides that, you also do bus tours, Bigfoot, camping trips,
Hmm.
take an international tour to Ireland. Um,
Yes.
just a wonderful life. And there's so much here that I could, uh, let's see, what what is that anomalian.com? What is that you have you created that or
N
was
no, I haven't created that. That's it's a website that's sort of a warehouse, a storehouse of sorts for all sorts of strange articles about strange phenomenon and paranormal, reincarnation,
oh,
that sort of thing. And I contribute articles to them, so it's
I see.
mostly on the ghost of Ohio.
And so you also tour with Ohio's Ancient Earthworks, and you contribute to what the Victorian Seance recreations.
Well, we did, yeah, we've done a few Victorian seance, a recreation of the experiences, where we
Oh,
gather in darkened rooms and join hands and try to call up spirits of the dead. Now these are done as a recreation. We don't actually intend to connect with anybody, but we will sometimes rig it up so as you're in the room, maybe something will fly off a shelf, or thunder will crack, and you feel like you're in this having this authentic experience in the Victorian era.
well, that's the spirit of the poltergeist, huh?
Yes. Yes.
Playful ghost who bangs things around and does just teasing things.
Ornery.
Yeah, ornery, that's a good word. And we have stories of that at the Cultural Arts Center.
Mhm.
Fozzie Douglas could tell a few stories, and Jim Mason could tell a few stories, and they're around teasing behavior often. And
Mhm.
so we've got it. We just befriend those. I've not had the experience. I'm kind of jealous.
Well, maybe someday soon you'll
Yeah.
have one when you're least expecting it. I find that's usually when these things happen.
Yes. Well, Katie, have you ever had an experience? You're new. Have you had anything like that?
Oh, you're muted.
Yes, I would say yes.
You would say yes. Oh,
Yeah.
that's fun.
Yeah, what sort of things happened, Katie?
Just creepy like sensations. Probably, I mean, I tried to like reason it, but there have been some instances where things like seeing things or sensing things just don't really have a reason why. And a little bit more different, like sometimes it's creepy, sometimes it's more just premonition, like sensing something to come. But yeah, definitely. I'm a total believer in the
Oh, that's
spirit world.
wonderful.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Yeah. Well, one thing that I think is kind of interesting is communicating through this method. I have a friend, Shane, who recently made a little joke that these meetings are almost like modern seances, because we're all gathering around in these darkened rooms and saying, Elizabeth, are you there? Is there anyone with you? Can you hear us? We can hear you. That sort of thing. And what's really interesting, I think, about that is that a lot of the modern devices we use in the technology came from scientists in the Victorian era trying to reach the other side. Um, yeah, this actually, I happen to have one here. This is a thing called a radiometer, and it was invented in 1873 by the bottom of my radiometer fell off. It it was invented by a scientist in England, Sir William Crookes, in 1873, and he was one of the big spiritualists. They
Huh.
believed they could have these seances and communicate with the dead. And he lost a young brother that he loved very much whenever he was had just entered adulthood, and he was desperately trying to contact him. So he invented that thing, and then it ended up being a precursor to the cathode ray, which is the tubes that we used in televisions and screens, and and he also discovered thallium. So but a lot of these things, Edison famously was trying to create a machine to talk to the dead as well. And that's, I mean, the technology, our cell phones, our computers that we carry in our pockets, all this stuff was intended to initially, or the technology was to
Mhm.
reach the other side.
Wow. Well, take it away, Bucky, as you prepared some images for us. And
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, so here that's me. And thank you, Lindsay, for putting all this together. I'm a little bit of a Luddite when it comes to using the technology to give a presentation. Now, if I'm going to be discussing um, uh, Ghost with you, we definitely have to talk about the Cultural Arts Center itself, because it's got a number of stories. And the Cultural Arts Center was on the site of what was the very first penitentiary in the state of Ohio. There it is. It's a little grainy image, but that was as it appeared, the site where the Cultural Arts Center is, in 1815. Originally, there was just one little building there with 13 cells, and then they had to keep expanding it and expanding it to accommodate the growing list of bad people. And so you can see it there as surrounded by a fence, and it was a little complex. And It as it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they needed to expand it, they realized that they had to think beyond this hill on the south end of downtown along the river, and they moved it to where the Nationwide Arena district is now in Burnham condominiums, and created a large 22-acre complex in 1834. And yeah, by 1856, I think I have a photo of what a little cleaner representation of what the, or that was 1846 rather, excuse me, the site where the Cultural Arts Center is now. That's how it appeared then. So one of the more notable things that happened on those grounds took place on February 9th, 1844, whenever there was a double hanging. There was a woman named Hester Foster. There's yeah, a picture of the scene. She was on the left, and then on the right is William Clark. Foster was she was a chambermaid from Cincinnati, and she was doing time for aiding in the assault and rape with intention to murder of another woman. And while she was in prison, she got in a fight with a fellow inmate in the kitchen, and she got her hands on a fire shovel and bashed the woman's brains to mush. So they decided they ought to hang her for that. And William Clark, or Graham, the gentleman on the right, the figure there, he was doing time for highway robbery, and he was in the penitentiary. And in June of 1841, he got his hands on an axe and chopped off the head of a prison guard, Cyrus Sells, who was uncle to the Sells brothers that had the famous circus in town. And so they decided to hang them both at once on February 9th, 1844. And despite Columbus not being a very old city at that point, Columbus was founded in 1812, over 10,000, between an estimation between 10,000 and 20,000 people showed up to witness this hanging. They said that the roads to Columbus were just lined with wagons full of families for a radius of about 150 miles. So it was gruesome, but that was the form of entertainment back then. So now, something I'm going to, because we're doing an arts program, I'm going to sort of take you on this little path and touch on a connection to an artist. Grave robbing was a really big problem in Central Ohio in the 1800s. There were a lot of medical colleges here, and the best way for professors and doctors to teach their students was to show them and do that with actual bodies. But very few people would donate their remains to science, because at that period they didn't believe doing so would permit entry to heaven. So doctors were forced to sneak into graveyards under cover of night with a shovel and procure their specimens by themselves. And this was mostly a classist thing in the 1800s. The typical victims would be the poor, racial minorities, criminals, and patients from the state mental hospital and that sort of thing. Because if the doctors got caught digging someone up and people complained, they'd say, yeah, who cares? You're just, you're poor, you're black, whatever. And they could get away with it. So William Clark was really easy the target whenever they hung him that day. Hester Foster actually did donate her body to science in exchange for all the candy she could eat leading up to her execution, because she knew, like, hey, what's a few extra pounds going to matter in a week or two? I'll be dead. So William Clark, however, whenever they hung him, they cut him down and buried him under the gallows, and two different groups showed up and got in a gunfight over the body. And it's not really clear exactly who claimed it, but there was a Dr. Ichabod Jones, who was actually the attending physician at the penitentiary at the time of that execution, who later had an office in downtown Columbus, in where the commons are now, where we have our food truck festivals and picnic with the pops. And he had a severed foot in a jar on his desk. Excuse me, cat hair. But he had a foot in a jar. You'd be ushered back. It's Miss O'Shaughnessy, the doctor's ready to see you now. And you'd go in, and there you would see this foot bobbing around in a jar of alcohol, and all of a sudden you'd start to feel like you maybe should get a second opinion. But it was Clark's foot, and interestingly, the very first museum in the city was operated by a man named George Walcott, just a half a block away, and it had a number of wax figures in the museum, and one of them that they really advertised, one of the big hits, was a very realistic reproduction of William Clark, the axe murderer. So I kind of imagine that he'd probably have been rolled in wax and propped up in a corner, and you needed to pay a nickel to see him, and somehow the foot ended up just a few doors down in the doctor's office. And this George Walcott, he was a brother to William Walcott, the artist that and sculptor that created the memorial to Commodore Perry. That's right. Yeah. Sorry, it's a little early for me. It took me a second to memorize it. Now, I was telling you a little bit about spiritualism a few moments ago, and there was an incident concerning this gentleman, George Walcott, that I think is really fascinating. Just a block south of where his museum was, on the corner of Town and High, on Rich and High, there was an amusement hall in 1851, and there was a period in that year when they were doing a series of seances in this hall, and people would come from all over around the city and participate. There was a darkened room, pitch black, and folks would join hands and call up the dead, and instruments would float through the room and play themselves, tambourines jangling in midair. And during one of these events, a couple journalists from the Ohio Statesman, which was the big newspaper in town at the time, got a little suspicious, and they sensed that they might have a good story on their hands. So they snuck in a couple candles to the seance. And as all these instruments are floating around and these eerie strains of music are filling the air, they pulled out the candles, lit them, and exposed a couple people dressed all in black holding these things, wandering around the table, and exposed it as fraud. And it became this big expose that people thought, okay, seances aren't real, this is a hoax, and it was a scam. But this George Walcott fellow was, he believed himself to be a bit of a gifted medium, and he was at that seance as well, and he sort of put a spin on this whole situation that seemed to indicate that no, maybe ghosts are real. He said that he was sitting in the table and these instruments were floating by, and he thought he saw a hand or two, and he suspected there was fraud as well. And he was about to get out of his chair and expose it. But as he tried to get up, he felt these invisible hands hold him down in his chair, and a voice whispered in his ear, "Don't you get up, George Walcott. Your career in life depends on it." So he stayed where he was at. And then a moment later, the journalists had lit their candles and exposed the fraud. And he realized that that spirit that was talking to him and kept him in his place, had it not intervened, he would have been standing up next to these guys about to expose them himself, and he would have appeared as a fraud. So that's how he spun this whole thing to say, no, the ghosts are real, and they actually saved me from getting in trouble. So that's kind of a fun story, I think, concerning that. Now, I think moving on beyond the hanging here, the Cultural Arts Center, yeah, you've had lots and lots of wonderful experiences and ghost stories there, right? Often Hester is said to occupy the ceramics area, I believe, and I know strange things go on with the elevators. Todd is here somewhere, I think, maybe still, and he had an experience with a woman several years ago seeing a little girl on the 3rd floor, and I've heard of several other people having experiences with that. Yeah, Vossi has. I've talked to her once or twice. It's been a while because of COVID, but I know that she's had some interesting experiences as well. And it's interesting. Folks often report seeing this Civil War soldier as well, a ghost. And now he was the prison that was there was torn down in 1856. In 1861, the building that is the Cultural Arts Center was constructed as an arsenal for the Ohio militia. And yeah, folks have reported seeing this Civil War soldier. I know that there was a mother-daughter team years ago that did an investigation, and in the northeastern turret, they captured electronic voice phenomenon where you ask a question as you're recording, and then when you play it back, you hear responses that weren't audible at the time, and they got a voice that just said the name Peter and Peter, Peter, Peter over and over again. And one thing that's interesting about that too is there's actually just behind the Cultural Arts Center where the interstate now was a place called Peter's Run, and that was it was a rather poor community. It was a little ravine with a lake and excuse me, a stream that led into the Scioto, and it was named Peter's Run for a gentleman who had a tannery there, Peter's. And in those days, tanning leather involved use of urine and all sorts of stinky things like that. So it was a very undesirable and unsavory part of town. But there are stories about how spiritualism took hold in Columbus very early on. In fact, actually, the Ouija board, as we know it, was first mentioned in a New York Times article as having appeared here in Central Ohio before it became a patent William Fudd sort of item. But spiritualism did eventually die away in most of Columbus, but there was that Peter's Run area where the interstate is, right behind the Cultural Arts Center, that was said to be a real hub of spiritualist activity, holding seances and that sort of thing, well into the turn of the century. Now, I don't know if that has anything to do with Peter, the soldier, probably not, but it's just kind of a fun coincidence and something that's nearby. Now, the image on the screen now, that's the second Ohio State Penitentiary that was built in 1834. And yeah, it was a beauty. It's one of the reasons we do these ghost tours, because it was such a interesting place, and it had such a impact on the identity of Columbus as a city, the state of Ohio, the United States itself, and just human culture in general. O. Henry, the man that wrote the book, the Christmas fable, The Gift of the Magi, where the man sells his pocket watch to buy a gold comb for his wife, and she sells her hair to buy him a chain for his pocket watch. And yeah, that was written by him while he was doing time in the penitentiary there, ironically for embezzlement. So I like to think that he was, intending to buy his boss a golden comb with the money, and he just didn't get a chance and got caught instead. But that penitentiary has so many amazing ghost stories, and one of the earliest ones I've ever discovered in my research took place there. No, we used to have a bunch of urban cemeteries. We sort of touched on it, I think, briefly, Ellen, where the North Market was the city's first big cemetery. There was one where Children's Hospital is. There was one where Columbus State Community College is. There was also another one down just south of 104 and 23. That was a pest house and plague cemetery, which I always, doing research, would read these stories about these epidemics and wonder, what would that have been like? And here we are. what a time to be alive. Because we did have a lot of these urban cemeteries, there was a problem with, there being a bunch of dead people, then a grocery store and dead people and a drinking well and house. And having these corpses in our water, cholera became a huge problem. And between 1848 and 1851, it swept through the city and killed many, many, many residents of Columbus. And we decided to dig up these urban graveyards and transfer them to the newly founded Greenlawn Cemetery, which was part of the rural cemetery movement as opposed to these graveyards and population centers. And some beautiful rolling hills and everything. And Ellen, you're, if I remember correctly, you have a great grandmother.
Yes, Sarah Frances Malcolm Doherty.
And she's buried near Eddie Rickenbacker, right? Yeah. Okay. It's the old girl's still working.
Yes.
Yeah, but so anyway, whenever this cholera epidemic that was happening between 1848 and 1851, whenever it hit the penitentiary, it was especially vicious, and they were confined in these close quarters, and it just tore through and was killing inmates at a rate faster than they could bury them, 30 to 40 a week, by some accounts. And there's an old history book that has a chapter about this epidemic in the penitentiary, and it mentions how different doctors tried to come and help the patients, or excuse me, the inmates, and ended up contracting cholera themselves and dying. The very first permanent resident of Greenlawn Cemetery is a Dr. Benjamin Guard, and it says on his stone, right under his name, died of cholera, so there's no mistaking what killed him. But he was one of the early doctors that tried to help these inmates at penitentiary and ended up contracting it. But this in this history book, there's a paragraph at the end of the chapter on cholera in the pen, and it seems sort of out of place, considering it's a history textbook. It mentions how the cholera epidemic has waned, and to quote directly, it said, "After the cholera epidemic was over, strange things, the neighbors say, then began to happen there. Wild shrieks would be heard to issue forth from the hollow tomb. Dead men would come again and walk about, and the great bell would ring, untouched by human hands." So these were neighbors to the penitentiary that were experiencing these ghosts and hearing their screams and seeing them. And the church bells, there was a Catholic and a Protestant church within the prison walls. The church bells would be ringing wildly away, and people living nearby could look out their windows and see that they were completely stationary, even though they were hearing these things. So that was just an interesting thing about it. Now, the inmates also had lots of experiences. I think these typically seem to be the result of victims of their crimes coming back to haunt them. And one in particular that I'm fond of, it was a man named Charles Clayton, who in 1905 requested a audience with the warden. He was doing time for stealing a horse in Delaware, Ohio, and he met with the warden, and the warden said, "Yeah, what can I do for you?" And Clayton said, "I need you to put me in Old Sparky and execute me, please." And the warden said, "Son, please, relax. You just stole a horse. Keep your nose clean and you'll be free in a couple months, no need to stress out." And he said, "You don't understand. The reason I stole that horse is because 12 years ago, I committed a murder. And it was a young girl, 15 years old, named Alma Wilmore, who was the love of his life at the time in Benton, Illinois. And he was 22, I believe. There's, usually a bit of an age discrepancy in those days, it seemed, in relationships. But they started dating, and then she met someone else and fell in love with him. And Charles decided to back out gracefully, and he moved to another town so she could continue on with her life with this other man, and he wouldn't have to suffer being a witness to it. Shortly after he moved away, he gets a letter from her begging him to come back and saying that this other guy had treated her poorly, and being in love, he jumped at the chance and returned and said, Alma, here I am. Let's get married and have a happy life. And she said, no, it's too late. I've ruined everything. I just want to die. In fact, I want you to die. Let's die together and have a suicide pact. So they decided to go ahead and do that and die together. And they went out to this old abandoned farmhouse, and there was a well out back, and that's where they were going to do this deed. And then they got into an argument over how it was going to work out. You know, you're going to have to kill me, then kill yourself. I can't kill you. You're going to have to kill me, then kill yourself. No, you're going to have to kill you and kill. And they got in this argument, and eventually Charles said, oh, right. And he just grabbed a stick and he hit her over the head and threw her body down the well. And he pulled the gun out and put it to his temple and then said, nah, and walked away, leaving Alma in the well. And the guilt of that caused him to continually commit these petty crimes to try to pay penance for what he had done. And he seemed to be able to successfully run from his feelings and that guilt for 12 years. But once he got to the penitentiary there, he was not able to run any further. And Alma started appearing to him in the dark, damp corners of the cell at night, saying, Charles, why haven't you made good on your end of the bargain? Why aren't you here with me? And he would see her passing back and forth in the corridors in front of his cell door at night and hear her all the time. And eventually it drove him to the point that he had to confess. And up until then, she had been considered a missing person, but the authorities went and checked the well and they found the skeleton, and he was extradited to Illinois, but they decided rather than give him his wish and execute him so he could be with his beloved, it would be a little bit better if he spent his life rotting in a prison cell with her ghost. That's my kind of justice, I'd say. So now, in addition to the neighbors and the inmates themselves having experiences, so did the guards. There was a in the central guard room, there was a bell system, kind of like on Downton Abbey, where they have these big panels with bells leading to all these different sections of the prison. And if an inmate were to find themselves in trouble in any cell block or area, they could ring a bell for backup. Well, on Easter in 1915, there was a group of guards sitting around a cell or around the main guard room, and the bell for the roof of that building started ringing wildly. So they assumed that there was violence afoot, and they all grabbed their weapons and went rushing up to the roof. And when they got up there, instead of finding any sort of horrific scene, there was just a lone guard patrolling back and forth, sort of thing. And they asked him why he was ringing the bell so wildly. They thought he was being murdered, and he said he hadn't touched the bell. And as they're discussing this, all of a sudden they hear this blood-curdling scream come from the far end of the roof. And they look down, and there's a white shrouded figure standing there. And their adrenaline was already pretty high because they were preparing to do battle with whoever was attacking the guard, they thought. And whenever they saw this thing and it was emitting the scream, they just unloaded on it with their weapons and shot. And rather than it, grab its chest and say, oh, you got me, Doc, it just stood there for a moment. And then it stepped behind a chimney. And this really sent a chill down everyone's spines. And they still had ammo left in their weapons, so they went down and went around both sides of the chimney, expecting to find this figure there, and there was nothing whatsoever. As they were scratching their heads, all of a sudden they heard this maniacal cackling sound coming from the other end of the roof. So they ran down there to inspect it, and there was no one. There was nowhere anyone could have gone. They were on a roof, and they were just left thinking, okay, maybe stories are true. This place does have ghosts. So they, retire to the guard room, and all the more creeped out than then when they left it. And the next day, an old prison guard came to work, and he heard this story, and he said, "Yeah, don't you guys remember? Well, you're probably didn't work here then. You might not have even been born. But years ago, there was an inmate on Easter that tried to escape on that particular section of roof, and we had to shoot him down and kill him. That might be your ghost." So, yeah, the penitentiary is quite storied, and it's a wonderful place to tell
Take
stories
a
about.
moment to get some responses here.
Hmm.
And anything that's triggered in your thought about an experience that you had, or just a response to what Bucky is saying, remembering that prison on that corner. Was it Buck Reinhardt who was part of saying we're gonna have to replace it?
He got in trouble for just taking a wrecking ball and swinging it into it.
No, anybody have any responses to Bucky?
Well, I don't have anything to do with the penitentiary because it was knocked down 4 years before I came to Columbus.
Oh.
And I don't know if this qualifies, it's nothing to do with the penitentiary, but sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I have this idea that there's somebody sleeping on an army cot next to my bed, and it's my mother. And I live by myself, so it can't be anybody else. And I wake up and it seems so real that I have to like shake my head to make sure that I wasn't just dreaming that. I don't know if that falls into this category or not.
It does. It does. But isn't it wonderful whenever loved ones visit you, though, and the notion of that?
I felt my father's presence. Now, I can't say that it was necessarily a paranormal one this morning, but my daughter's been waiting. She works in St. Louis as an engineer, and she's been waiting for a COVID test result because her husband, who's also an engineer and been flying all over the country repairing helicopters, has gotten crazy COVID. So she's waiting, and she's had congestion and whatever, and it's been 4 days now. And I got a sense from my father, he would say, if such and such doesn't happen, he may say it to me or whatever, you're going to know the Marines have landed. I got the strength of that. I texted Ian, and she said, I remember you're telling me that story. I said, you get on them and get that result. Not one more day are we going to wait to know whether you have crazy COVID.
That's
But it was a moment of just strength and presence. And whatever paranormal it is, or what would Carl Jung say about, did I dream it last night and just woke up with that chutzpah this morning? We still don't know if she has this 4 days later, and she's developing symptoms. The children, 10-year-old twins now, have been tested, but they don't know yet. Her husband was tested right away because he'd been flying all over the country, and they just did it routinely. But sure enough,
wow.
COVID. Yeah.
That's frightening in its own sense, and I truly hope that everything's going to be okay for them. And that's we had a scare here last week. I had to get tested. It took about 4 or 5 days to get the results, which seems ridiculous, but I understand. There's a lot of people that are, as the numbers are rising, I think these places are being overwhelmed with the number of tests being administrated. And for your father to come through, though, that's
I love it now.
yeah. Yeah, he's got your back.
Very good, Bucky. That's a good one. Anybody else? Anybody else on whom we cannot see?
It says there are 9 people participating on my screen.
Where are you in spirit? Where are you? They may have their mute buttons on too, right?
No, that's okay. Yeah.
Brian on the bottom there. Hi, Brian,
Ah,
Hi.
good.
the Michigan man.
Ah,
Hello.
yes. Uh-huh. Great.
Yeah. Hello. Um, yeah. So, oops.
Now you went moot.
Okay. Now I'm unmuted, right?
Good.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Well, so the prison, that was really, that was a really interesting place. But there's also, I think, the next slide might be, the Franklin County Jail that was just right up the hill a little ways from where the Culture Arts Center is, and that building was designed by George Bellows Sr. George Bellows, artist, father, was an architect, and he designed it. It was torn down in 1971, but it actually had a number of stories, and it was the site of the only other public execution to happen in Franklin County, aside from the one that happened just there behind the Cultural Arts Center in 1844. In 1884, there was a man named Frank Grainer who he had um, fallen in love with this girl named Margaret Sealing, and everything was going pretty well for them. But then friends told her that he had supposedly committed murder back in Germany before he immigrated, and to stay away from him. And whenever she suddenly started giving him the cold shoulder, he lost his mind and did indeed murder her. And just through some little bit of odd paperwork, he ended up being executed there instead of at the penitentiary. And there are quite a few different ghost stories that were associated with that place. In 1904, there was a woman who was in one of the cells, and she woke up in the middle of the night, and there was someone in the cell with her. It was a hooded figure crouching down at the foot of her bed that was semi-transparent. And waking up and seeing this sort of thing, she went and reached for the person, and her hands went right through it, and she ran out terrified. There was another incident in it was 1908, I believe it was, or 1906, when there was a gentleman who was doing time there for having murdered a guard at the Ohio Penitentiary, and in the middle of the night he kept feeling someone putting their hand over his face, and he couldn't sleep because every time he'd try to fall asleep they would touch him. And he called for the alarm, and the guards show up, and he's locked in a cell. There's nowhere anyone could go if they had been in there, and he's the only one. And they thought maybe he was just trying to draw attention to himself or something. But actually, a year later, there was a young boy, a little boy doing time in the jail cell, because in those days we'd throw children, men, women, and everybody just all got lumped in together into the prison. And there was a little boy staying in that cell, and he was having the exact same experience. So there's that. And another more interesting story that happened there. There was a inmate who was a trustee. He was well behaved enough to be given different tasks within the jail. And in the winter of 1908, he had to go down into the basement and check the furnace and stoke the fires. And when he went down there, this cold blast of air passed through and extinguished his lantern. And then he heard a voice say, "I'm the ghost of Frank Castor, and I'm going to kill you." And Frank Castor was a gentleman who had he'd been executed at the penitentiary, but was serving time in that jail for having killed a prison guard and a police officer as well. So, but it's gone. It's lost to history. That's okay. You can go ahead and move it if you want to, Lindsay. It's just one of those interesting buildings that was destroyed. The stories are all but forgotten, and I love that through this legends and ghost stories, we can sort of bring back the memory and discuss these places that have since been lost to history. And that's one thing I really like about ghost stories themselves too, is a lot of times like that an incident that occurred on the roof of the penitentiary in 1915 in Easter. It's a forgotten moment. You know, no one remembered that there had been a prisoner shot down trying to escape there, but sometimes these ghosts are moments from history that have been lost coming back and tapping you on the shoulder and saying, don't forget about me. Now, with that said, this is a kind of a perplexing one. That's on the screen is the old Hoster Brewing Company offices. And there are a couple of different ghostly incidences there that occurred. The winery Via Vecchia or Vecchia, I'm not sure exactly if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but they had a, they were housed there for a while. Now they're moved further down High Street, but they were having all sorts of experiences in their office, and wine bottles would get knocked over off shelves, fly off shelves, doors would rattle, that sort of thing. And they ended up having to, they found that playing New Age music seemed to quell the spirits and calm them down and stop all this sort of activity. Either that, or maybe it just bored them to death and they decided to go on somewhere else. But that was interesting. And there's also an African-American woman who was seen in a section of the building that was once stables for the horses that would carry the wagons when the brewery was in there. That's that site's now occupied by the theater, Catco, I believe, there, or Shadowbox, excuse me. And yeah, people still see this woman to this day. When it was whenever the radio station CD 101, now 102.5, was broadcasting from there, one night a DJ had her young child with her, and she was doing an overnight show, so she had him and made a little bed for him on the stage. And she was doing her show, and all of a sudden she heard a crash and looked, and the lighting fixtures had fallen on the stage where he was laying, and she panicked, thinking her child had just been killed. And she threw off her headset, ran over, and he was standing off on the wings on the side of the stage, completely fine. And you know, as her heart rate finally reduced to a tolerable level, she asked him what he was doing over there, because he had been sound asleep moments earlier. And he said that he was woken by a woman, a very nice lady, who told him to get up and stand and to move over to that corner just a second before the lighting fixtures had fallen. Now, I've spoken to someone who's actually seen her multiple times. A gentleman who's been on one of our tours, Jason, he used to work as a prep cook at the kitchen there, and that involved getting up early and being there at 6:30 in the morning, and you know, chopping vegetables and that sort of thing. And he would usually be the first one in that section of this structure. And when he'd be doing his work early on, he'd start to get the sense that he wasn't alone, that there was someone in the room with him. And when he'd turn around and look, he'd see this woman peeking her head around the corner, and she'd dart it back after he made contact with her. And he would assume that this was one of his coworkers that had shown up early, and he would call out their names, no response. And so he'd walk down to see why they're not answering him. And when he'd turn the corner, he'd see the doors to the theater swinging as if someone had just walked through them. So he'd go over there, throw the doors open, expecting to see his coworkers, and it would be an empty room. So he said that he's had that experience at least 6 or 7 times, which I think is just wonderful. Now, the interesting thing is she is, a lot of the stories say that she was someone who was killed during a fire that struck that stables area and killed a bunch of horses. But I don't know. I've done the research, and I found that there was a fire that swept through there in 1908, I believe. And they killed 25 horses, but there's no mention of any human being killed there. So I don't know. Maybe she was someone who just happened to work in the building through another time. So often people seem to feel the need to associate ghosts with tragic occurrences, but not necessarily. It doesn't seem to be a qualification. She could have been someone who just really enjoyed working there, and she's still around. Oh.
You know, I've questioned when I've been working for the Cultural Arts Center 30 plus years, and when my children were very young, I would go in at 7 in the morning before the custodian came, open the doors, go in, and I would get to the elevator and it would open for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that's weird because I didn't call it to get me. And somebody said later, like, let's say years later, no, that was just an automatic thing that the elevator does. And I think we're still saying that. Anybody hear that too? That it will just come down and periodically land on the first floor, whatever. But that was the only time I ever felt it in the midst of a number of other stories, which you've heard, Bucky.
Yeah.
And then the Berkey Paranormal says, yes, there are spirits at the Cultural Arts Center, and they seem to be more like playful ghosts, and Hester is thought to be one of them. Was she hung right there at Mound and someplace?
And second, yeah, Mound and second, yeah, just so where you get on the interstate, there where there's a little power substation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that sort of, I think, functioned as a natural amphitheater, the way the land curves, so they held it there.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Well, I mean, I have no idea. It's just like you let go of it, but you do wonder,
Mm-hmm.
you know, why. And greet me at 7 in the morning, and okay, no,
You gotta love it when they're friendly and helpful.
yes, yes. Yeah, I was thinking too, as the days go on, what, about 9 or 10 days until Halloween? When is that? Like a Saturday. It's a
Yeah.
Saturday this year, so there'll be a lot of activity.
And a
But,
full moon.
and oh yeah,
So
yeah.
there'll be a lot of werewolves as well.
And the next day, of course, is All Saints. So, and all the experiences of the saints in the paranormal is phenomenal. But who knows, right?
Yeah. It certainly is going to, the stage is set for it to be a very interesting Halloween.
Yeah. Well, that's true, because the next day is All Souls, and then the next day is Election Day.
Mm-hmm. My fingers crossed.
Series of challenges.
Yes,
Our
indeed.
humor high, which isn't it a form of transcendence to have a sense of humor? In other words, you must, Bucky, seeing through all of this, maintain humor. Otherwise, you'd be spooked.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's, when I started doing these, I began having experiences in my own house, and I wasn't quite prepared for that sort of thing. And how I would usually deal with it was run to the television and put on a Golden Girls marathon, or something, to just sort of shift gears and focus away from it. But I do think that there's, in hospitals and people that deal with a lot of, and by nature, ghost stories, you deal with some pretty grim subject matter and death a lot and that sort of thing. And you have to have a sense of humor about it. Otherwise, yeah, you'd never be able to sleep at night. And we sometimes end up getting, it can be a bit dark, gallows humor, but it helps get us through, like one joke at the beginning of this whole thing I was telling people was the one, in the midst of a respiratory pandemic, why are graveyards so noisy?
Hmm.
Because of all the coughing.
Oh.
So, better at the ghost stories, I guess.
That's good. Ah, well, as we are coming close to 1, speaking of Otterbein, our wonderful technological expert here, Lindsay, has a class. And at 1, we have to come to closure at 1 o'clock.
Yes.
But we want to say to you, Bucky, thank you
Oh,
for bringing us to this amazing, phenomenal phenomenon, huh?
yes. Thank you very much. Um,
Research and also your trips. You went to Ireland and you to do the Bigfoot camping, and
mhm.
let's know more what you do and what you have scheduled, so that when we can travel,
Yes.
we can consider being with you.
Yeah, well, yeah, we'll be doing more trips to Ireland once that's a possibility again, and bus tours around the city and the region, visiting the ancient earthworks here in Ohio. They're a testament to just the ingenuity of humankind, and as works of art and engineering feats. They're pretty phenomenal. So and the people who built them were rather spooky. So I like to take people and illustrate those. But right now I am doing a series of open air walking tours. We have downtown ones. We're doing tours of Green Lawn. I have a daytime tour that focuses on the Civil War era ghosts buried there. And since we can't drive around, what I would do is take people from gravesite to gravesite of people that are said to haunt various locations. So we're taking a virtual tour of the city, and you can socially distance, and everyone wears masks, and that's a good way to. And one other thing, if I can tell you real quick before we have to go, is I've been encouraging people all COVID long to visit these cemeteries, because I think they're open air art museums and history museums. The carvings are just incredible, and the iconography. And at the beginning of this whole pandemic and shutdown, I had some friends who were visiting a cemetery in Otterbein in Westerville, and I said, "See if you can find this. See if you can find that." And they went and did it, and they loved it. And it turned into this game we call Graveyard Bingo. I have a Graveyard Bingo place card there, and basically how it works is, you go out and see if you can find these different symbols and mark them off. And because I think this is going to be a very grim winter holiday season for a lot of families, because they've been adversely affected by financially by COVID, as well as emotionally. I'm making those play cards downloadable on our website, columbusghosttours.com, for $5 each. And
Tours.com.
yeah, columbusghosttours.com, and we're donating 90% of the proceeds to Toys for Tots to help make children's winter holidays a little bit brighter than the rest of 2020 has been for many of us. And yeah, I just take out 42 cents or something like that for the processing fee. So you can download one, print out 4 or 5 copies, meet your friends in the cemetery, and set a time limit and see who can find the most. And maybe the loser has to spend the night there or something. You can set your own prize limits. But I think that's something fun, spooky to do, that's safe, and can kind of be in the spirit of Halloween.
And Inga, you were dancing beautifully on your beach. Where are you?
Did we lose her?
Well, we want to say thank you. It was wonderful.
Ellen, as always, thank you very much. It was great to see you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lindsay. Bye.
All right, bye everybody.